And here we are again, back to do more History of the Restoration Movement slideshow archives. This is module number 11, and in this module we will discuss Presbyterianism, which is specifically the Scottish state church. Now, to really unpack the problems that we will see and how the Restoration movement will interact with Presbyterianism, we're really going to need to kind of do a quick survey of the history of Presbyterianism in order to display the state of this church by the time Thomas and Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone are going to arrive on the scene. That, simply put, Presbyterianism is going to be a schismatic mess by the time the Restoration Movement founders are going to be well on their way. And by schismatic, I simply mean that there are many schisms or divisions within Presbyterianism. And to explain how they got there, well, that's going to require a historical tour. So let's begin with the question, how did the Church of Scotland become a state church? Well, the story really begins when this nice young man, and I use this term loosely, and this nice but barren woman, I also use this term loosely, failed to conceive a son. This would be Henry VIII and Catherine Aragon. Now, I know what you're thinking. So, a lot of people have difficulty conceiving. So why is this one conception difficulty going to spark a church into being? Well, here's where this sordid tale gets started. Henry VIII is really only the second king in his dynasty. His brother didn't hold the throne long. And the entire Tudor dynasty really only came into power within Henry's lifetime. And so what that will mean is that they've just got done fighting a pretty brutal civil war. To become king, Henry VIII and his family had to walk over a lot of other potential royalty. And there's quite a mess of bodies that are left over from what is known as the War of the Roses. And so, when Henry finally comes to power, he realizes that if he wants to avoid another English Civil War, he'd better have a male issue on the throne. And so, Henry and Catherine will have a daughter, Mary. But they won't have a son. And Henry is going to fear that the moment he dies, the barons and the lords of England are going to resume their fighting because, hey, there's an empty throne and who's going to fight us for it? Mary? Catherine? And so, in short, the English king, Henry VIII, is going to be asking the question, how do I secure my throne? And unfortunately, his wife, Catherine, is not playing along with this idea. So, Henry will devise a pretty interesting but brutal plan. Henry will petition Pope Clement VII for an annulment. Now, an annulment is very different from a divorce. A divorce generally means that you simply declare a marriage over. An annulment means that you declare a marriage as though it never happened, in which case Catherine loses all of her status as Queen of England, and Mary will lose any rights as firstborn child to the throne. So, needless to say, an annulment would look very bad for Catherine. And here's where the politics starts coming in. The Pope is very heavily allied with Charles V of Spain. Charles V is a close relative of Catherine of Aragon, and, well, Rome has recently been sacked in 1527. And so the Pope is relying heavily on Charles V for military protection. take this all together and swirl it around, and what you get is Henry is in no means going to get an annulment from the Pope. And so Henry is going to have to take matters into his own hands if he wants to get some level of satisfaction. And get satisfaction Henry will. Henry will simply, instead of waiting for the Pope to endorse his annulment, will break with the Roman Catholic Church. And instead of having the Pope in Rome as the head of the Church of England, as it used to be, Henry will declare himself as the head of the English Church, or the Anglican Church. Now, this will begin the Protestant Reformation in England. And subsequently, these Protestant ideas will start to reach Scotland, which is where we ultimately are looking in that direction. Now, also keep in mind that this Reformation in England, when it first gets started under Henry VIII, will be doctrinally conservative, and by that meaning it won't deviate much from the standards of Roman Catholicism. And it will really take King Henry VIII to pass away before others, more radical reformers, will get in there and start taking charge of transforming the church into a purely reformed church. And the person really behind this is going to be a man named Thomas Cranmer. Now I know what you're asking. How can Thomas Cranmer shape the English church if the King of England is the head of the church? Well, there's a very simple explanation for this. When Edward VI takes the throne, he is the very young child of Henry's fourth wife. And this young child will still be in his teenage years by the time he comes to the throne. And he won't live to see 20. Meaning that while he may be head of the church, Cranmer, as Archbishop of Canterbury, will have pretty much full control to lead the Reformation as he sees fit. Now, one of the things Cranmer will produce that I recommend almost anyone take a good long look at, just because it's a pretty phenomenal book. Cranmer will produce what is known as the Book of Common Prayer, and this will regulate Protestant worship in England. Now, to add to the shenanigans, I'd like to note that not only is Edward VI young when he becomes king, he is also kind of a sickly and frail child, and he will die young as well. And so when he dies, his older sister from Henry VIII's first marriage, this sister named Mary, will return from Spain and claim the English throne. Now, Mary is very much Catherine's daughter. She is going to have went back to Spain with Catherine, and Mary will be strongly Roman Catholic. And so when she comes back to England, she is going to try to make Protestantism go away in England. And she will take several steps to make this happen. For starters, she will kill Cranmer and many of the other Protestants in an attempt to reinstitute Roman Catholicism. Many of these people will die very bloody deaths, usually by burning at the stake. And this will earn her the title of Bloody Mary. Now, keep in mind that not only was the Reformation getting to England, it was also getting to Scotland. But Mary I, as queen over both of these realms, she will begin persecuting Protestants in both England and Scotland. And it should be noted that during this time, many of the Scottish Protestants will find a way to flee to the mainland of Europe and eventually make their way to Geneva, Switzerland. Now, this is important because John Calvin is currently in charge of Geneva at this time, and he will be all up until the end of Mary's reign. And so this entire time, Geneva will become a safe haven for many English Protestants, and particularly Scottish Protestants. And from a Protestant's perspective, this will often be called the Marian exile of the church, because the Protestant church will be in exile from England because of Mary. And we should note that probably one of the most important of these Scottish exiles is a man named John Knox. Now, John Knox will study directly with Calvin and Calvin's, we'll call it protege, Theodore Beza. And he will become enamored with Calvinism. And he'll become enamored with two big aspects of Calvinism. First, he'll take on the theological system of Calvinism, the entire tulip, total depravity, irresistible grace, limited atonement. He'll take that whole system. But he'll also take on the system of governmental control over, or governmental control, i.e. that the church should be in direct control of the state. Knox will consider that the tight control of the state that Calvin promotes over the city of Geneva, he will go so far as to call it the most perfect school of Christ on earth. Basically meaning, if you want to teach a country or a state how to become Christian, simply make the church its king. And essentially, he is stating that he would like to see strong church control over the state in order to properly reform a country. And we're going to see this where when Knox comes back to Scotland, there is going to be very strong Scottish influence, but the church influence on the state. But then we're also going to see the state push back. And eventually, kings and other barons will tightly control the Church of Scotland. And so, an interesting irony, when Knox arrived, he probably would have wanted to have seen Scotland become a church state. Instead, it will become a state church. So here's the timeline. In 1559, Knox will return from Geneva and try to restart the Reformation in Scotland. And by 1560, the Presbyterian Church will be founded. Now, this Protestant denomination known as the Presbyterian Church is the national church of Scotland. Now, it will take a while for this entire reform to take hold. For example, it will not be until 1689 that the rank of bishop will be completely abolished in Scotland. But keep in mind that, at least for the initial run of this, the Presbyterian Church will be very different from Catholic or Anglican churches. First, instead of having a single bishop governing a large geographical area, a group of elders known as presbyters will control local churches at the local level. But then that asks the question, how do we keep this denomination that covers an entire country of Scotland? How do we keep regional cohesion? How do we keep one region in step with the other regions? And the answer to that is going to be synods. And so the presbyteries will form into larger groups called synods, and these synods will meet regularly and enforce protocol over large regional areas. And then to further stress this, the synods will all gather together once a year for national cohesion. And when these synods all gather together, this will be known as the General Assembly. And so all of these assemblies are delegate bodies. There's no one person in charge of it. And all of these bodies could rightly call the people who are represented therein elders. So the presbyteries have elders, the synods have elders, and the general council has elders. Now, the strength of this system is that it is an attempt to take the biblical passage 1 Timothy 3, 1 and following, on church eldership very seriously. That the description in 1 Timothy is a person who is local, a person who is in the business of preaching and basically doing pastoral work among his people. And so this will make a lot of sense at the presbytery level, that at the local level, a local elder can perform many of these tasks. However, the further you get, an elder in the General Assembly, especially one that meets in like a big city like Edinburgh or Glasgow, may not have much to do with a small town church that meets on the small island of Iona, for example. And so, what I'd like to stress here is that while this is an attempt to take the passage seriously and have elders instead of a single bishop, it still doesn't necessarily follow exactly what the scripture seems to be getting at. Now, there's also an inherent weakness of this system, and that is it's still a national hierarchy. This general council can, and indeed they will, boss around local churches that are distant from the governing body, which means that even if the elders on the General Assembly, even if they've never met a person from a church, say in Ireland or in Philadelphia, they can still make policy so that it affects this distant church. And this will become very, very problematic as the American Revolution in particular was fought over the idea that there should not be distant monarchical rulership over the affairs across the pond. Well, this will also apply in many people's eyes to church matters, that just as they do not want a king to enforce his law from across the Atlantic Ocean, many will also chafe at the idea of a church General Assembly flexing its muscle from across the Atlantic as well. Now, there's also another kind of weakness, or all we call it a flashpoint, that will eventually flare up in the Presbyterian Church. And that is that the church will be closely allied with the Scottish crown, and then later, once the Scots and the English merge into a united kingdom, it will still be closely affiliated with the Scottish nobility. And this means that power plays are inevitable, that rulers will try to have their way in church matters. And this will often generate what are called schisms, or breaks within the church, where one side will favor often will favor someone in the nobility, while the other side of this church split will favor not as much nobility involvement. And as we will see, this will happen many, many times throughout the history of the Presbyterian Church. So the first and probably most notorious of these divisions is what is known as the Cedar division, which will produce the Cedar Presbyterian Church. And here's basically what happened. In 1733, many of the local lords and barons will try to claim the prerogative that they can name all the clergy in their realms. Well, this is going to raise a problem, because many of these local lords may be nominally Christian at best, or may not even be Christian at all. But if they can pick who their clergy is going to be within their lands, it means that they can give these offices to their friends. It means they can give these offices to preachers who may not preach against their policies. And so it makes a lot of sense for a lord to pick all the preachers in their land, because they can basically ensure that the church will continue to side with them. Well, many Presbyterians, like Ebenezer Erskine, will raise a very strong protest against this. However, even though most records say that they were in the majority, the General Council will still deny hearing their protest. And so they will secede, just like how a couple of centuries later in the American Civil War, the southern states will secede from the Union. So these seceder Presbyterians have broken off from the main Presbyterian body. And they will call these kind of Presbyterians cedar Presbyterians. Now, not long after this, we're going to have another problem. And this is an issue involving another church-state issue called the Burgher Oath. Now, don't confuse this word burger with hamburger. By burgher, we simply mean a city, a burgh. And this is what the Burgher Oath was. The Burgher Oath was initially passed in Scotland to keep Roman Catholics from voting. And the law went like this. If you lived in a city, or burgh, you had to swear an oath to the state church, which was the Presbyterian Church. And, this worked fine for keeping Catholics out because no Catholic is going to swear an oath to the Presbyterian Church. To do so would be to become a Presbyterian. But the Burgher Oath now has a difficulty because if you're a Presbyterian who is a cedar Presbyterian, you still have to swear this oath to the other Presbyterian Church. Well, there's going to be 2 points of view on this. The Burghers are going to simply say, we're still swearing an oath to Presbyterianism. And you say tomato, I say tomato, we're still swearing an oath to the state church. And so this really isn't a problem. Now the Anti-Burghers are going to take this a little bit more strictly, and they're going to say, no, wait a second. The Cedar Church is the only true Presbyterian church. Those other people have sold out, and they are heretics. And if you swear allegiance to them, what does that mean for this whole secession we've done? And so, the second secession is going to be the Burghers and the Anti-Burghers. And the Anti-Burghers are specifically Presbyterians who are cedars who will not take the oath, while Burghers are those who are cedars but will take the oath. Now, finally, we're going to see a third division in the Presbyterian Church. And this will happen right about the time that Barton Stone and the rest of his kind are starting to get into this new form of revivalism. And this is going to involve two issues. The first is going to be the revivalism question. And the question is going to be mainly, can a good Presbyterian take part in a revival that attempts to stimulate someone emotionally in order to produce a saving experience? Now, the second issue they're going to deal with is another one of government authority over the church. The people who are in favor of revivalism will also be in favor of less government authority over the church. And these people will refer to themselves as new lights, often spelled Lichts, but pronounced new lights, because they're claiming to have a new perspective or new light on these issues. Now, the group that is going to want to maintain the status quo are going to call themselves old lights. And they're going to say, we are skeptical of revivalism, and we're okay with the status quo of the government authority that is already being exerted over the church. Okay, and this brings up a very interesting question. Where would Barton W. Stone be? In all likelihood, we would find him in the Cedar, Anti-Burgher, New Light Church. Now, this is going to be different from our next historical person we're going to look at, Thomas Campbell, who was very affiliated with the Old Lights. And so we're going to see that even after a lot of these groups split from the Presbyterians, the new light, old light question over revivalism is still going to be a dominant issue for the next few years. And so I'd just like to conclude by saying, if it sounds confusing, it was. So if you follow our chart here, the first secession happens in 1733, creating the Associate Presbytery. In 1747, the issue of the Burgher Oath comes up. The anti-Burghers will split one way. The Burghers will split another. In 1798, the anti-Burghers will split between old and new lights. And interestingly, in 1806, the Burghers will also split between old and new lights. And so what this means is you have the regular state church, which is represented by this bottom line all the way down here. And you have all of these other cedar groups. And so technically you have 4 different cedar groups. Old light, anti-Burgher cedars. New light, anti-Burgher cedars. Old light, Burgher cedars. And new light, Burgher cedars. And so, if that sounds confusing, it is. It makes a mess, especially when you realize that all 4 of these groups are pointing fingers at the others and saying, you are not the real Presbyterian Church. We're the real Presbyterian Church. The rest are heretics. Well, this is going to become highly frustrating for several people, and we'll discuss that here in the next module, but let it suffice to say that our next main personality we're going to look at, Thomas Campbell, is going to find himself initially affiliated with the Old Light, Anti-Burgher, Cedar Presbyterians. So, while this may seem like a lot of information to keep in mind, let me try to boil that down, because at its base, the problems with the Presbyterian Church are actually very basic. First, the problem that is facing the church is one of church-state problems. Not a single one of these divisions is based on doctrine. None of them are saying, one of these groups is denying the total depravity portion of Calvinism, for example, or the limited atonement problem. All of these groups are fine on their doctrine. The question is, how do they relate to the church state? And you'll notice the Bible will be very, very silent about how individual churches should react to individual governments. And so what we're seeing in the 18th and 19th century is that the Presbyterian Church is divided more over problems of government affiliation than incorrect belief. And it's also worth keeping in mind that this old light, new light question over revivalism will continue to be a burning question even after the Restoration movement firmly separates from Presbyterianism. So, in short, just keep in mind that church-state relationships are messy because, like as the Presbyterian Church shows, it gives people more to argue about than just doctrine. And particularly what they are arguing about is, how does this church relate to my government? And that can become very, very messy when accusations of heresy become accompanied with this, because at the end there's really no biblical way to defend this. It is simply a matter of government expediency with regards to how a church interacts with its government.